Marcus came home, but the man who left never did. He stepped off the transport with a limp he would carry for the rest of his life and a bag that held everything he owned. No one was waiting for him at the station. He had made sure of that. He had sent no messages, made no calls. He just walked out into the cold air and kept moving. The cabin was 3 hours north of the nearest town. He had bought it before the war, back when he still had plans. Back when he thought life would go a certain way. Now it was just walls and a roof and silence, and that was exactly what he wanted. He did not want people. People asked questions. People said things like, "You are a hero and we are proud of you," and Marcus could not stand to hear those words. Not anymore. He knew what had happened out there. He knew what the mission had cost. No medal could cover that and no speech could clean it. His name was Marcus Hale. He was 34 years old. He had served 8 years in the coalition ground forces, most of it on the front lines of a war that started when the Vreth attacked 3 human colonies without warning. Thousands died in those first strikes. Families, children, farmers, workers, gone in hours. The war that followed was long and ugly, and it left marks on everyone who survived it. Marcus had marks that no one could see. He lost his unit in the 3rd year. A mission gone wrong, a signal jammed, and 12 men and women caught in a place they could not get out of. Marcus was the only one who made it back. He did not talk about how. He did not think about it if he could help it. But at night, when the cabin was dark and the wind pushed against the walls, the memory came anyway. Danny's face always came first. Danny Voss had been his best friend since basic training. Loud, funny, always stealing the last cup of coffee. He had a daughter back home named Lily, and he talked about her every single day. He had a picture of her taped inside his helmet. He was going to go home after this deployment and teach her how to ride a bike. He never came home. Marcus carried that with him the way some men carry old injuries. It did not stop hurting. It just became part of how he moved through the world. He blamed the Vreth for all of it. Every one of them. He knew that some people back home talked about peace now, about treaties and shared borders and learning to understand each other. Politicians gave speeches. Reporters wrote long articles about how the Vreth had their own grief, their own reasons, their own side of the story. Marcus could not hear any of it. When he looked at the images of their long dark bodies and flat cold eyes, he felt something harden in his chest like stone. They had taken everything from him. Understanding was not something he had left to give. The cabin needed work when he arrived. The roof had a small leak. The wood stove needed cleaning. The back window had a crack running through it that let the cold in at night. Marcus fixed all of it himself, slowly, over the first few weeks. He had no timeline. He had nowhere to be. He just worked until he was tired, and then he slept, and then he worked again. It gave him something to do with his hands. It kept the thoughts at a distance. He did not go into town often. Once every 2 weeks for supplies, maybe less. He kept the visits short. He wore his hood up and paid without talking and drove back before anyone had a chance to recognize him. He had been mentioned in a few news reports after the war ended. He did not want to be recognized. He did not want to be thanked. He just wanted to be left alone. The nearest neighbor was a man named George who lived 4 kilometers down the road and waved from his porch whenever Marcus drove past. Marcus waved back once. It was enough. The days were quiet. Cold mornings, gray skies, the sound of wind in the trees. He made simple food and drank his coffee black and sat by the window sometimes and looked out at the forest without thinking much about anything. On good days, the silence felt almost peaceful. On bad days, it pressed down on him like weight. He did not let himself think about the future. There was no point. The future was just more days like this one, and that was fine. He was alive. That was more than Danny got. More than any of the others got. He told himself that on the hard nights. He was alive. He should be grateful. He was not always grateful. Some mornings he sat on the edge of his bed for a long time before he could make himself stand up. Not because of the leg. Because of the weight inside him that had no name. The war had taken things from him that no doctor could treat and no amount of time seemed to touch. He was not the same man who had enlisted. He was not sure what kind of man he was now. He was just Marcus. Alone in a cabin in the woods. Waiting for nothing in particular. And that was where he was the night the sky cracked open and something fell out of it. He heard it before he saw it, a low sound like tearing metal, and then a light through the window that was too bright and too fast. He stood up from his chair. He crossed to the door and opened it and looked out into the dark. Something had come down in the trees. Something was burning. Marcus stood very still. Then he reached back inside and picked up his coat. The storm had been building all evening. By the time Marcus stepped outside, the wind was sharp and the sky was throwing down cold rain in sheets. He pulled his coat tight and moved toward the tree line, following the glow that was still flickering between the branches. The ground was wet and uneven and his bad leg complained with every step, but he kept moving. He told himself he was just going to look. Just to make sure whatever had come down was not going to catch the trees on fire and burn toward the cabin. That was all. He had no other reason. The forest was loud with wind and rain. Branches moved overhead and the shadows jumped with the flickering light. It took him about 10 minutes to push through the undergrowth and find it. It was not large. That was the first thing he noticed. He had expected something the size of a ship, but what he found was small, maybe the size of a truck, roughly oval-shaped, with a cracked outer shell that was still smoking in the rain. The metal was a dark greenish color that he recognized immediately. He had seen that color before. On armor. On weapons. On the ships that had come screaming out of the sky over Colony 7. Breath. He stopped walking. Every muscle in his body pulled tight. His hand moved to his side before he remembered he was not carrying anything. He was not a soldier anymore. He was just a man in a wet coat standing in the woods. He stood there for a long moment, rain running down the back of his neck, staring at the pod. It was an escape pod. He could see that now. Small, single-use, built to carry passengers away from a larger ship in an emergency. It had come down hard. One side was caved in and there were long scorch marks across the top. Whatever had been in orbit above them was gone. This thing had fallen alone. He should go back to the cabin. That was the clear, simple thought in his head. This was not his problem. This was alien. This was Vreth. He had spent 8 years fighting these things. He had buried friends because of them. He had carried Danny's memory through every cold night for 3 years and he would carry it for the rest of his life because of what they had done. He should turn around. Walk back. Call it in to the regional defense office in the morning and let them deal with it. He almost did. But then he heard something. It was faint, almost swallowed by the rain and the wind. A sound from inside the pod. He could not quite identify it. He stood still and listened and heard it again. He walked closer without deciding to. There was a split in the side of the pod where the casing had cracked on impact. Not large but wide enough to see through if he got close. He crouched down and looked inside. The interior was dim. One small emergency light was still working, casting everything in a pale blue glow. There was debris inside. Broken equipment, loose padding that had been some kind of lining, a few dark pieces of something he could not identify. And in the center of it, tucked into a shallow depression in the floor, were 3 very small creatures. Marcus stared. They were tiny. Each one was no bigger than a house cat, maybe smaller. They had the general shape of the Vreth, long bodies, scaled skin, small folded limbs, but they were nothing like the soldiers he had faced in the field. These were not soldiers. These were not anything threatening. They were newborns. He could tell by how small they were, how unformed, how their eyes were still sealed shut. They had no claws worth mentioning. Their wings, if they would eventually have wings, were just soft little folds of skin pressed flat against their backs. They were trembling. All 3 of them, trembling together in a small pile, soaking wet from where the rain had come through the cracked hull. There was no adult with them. No mother. No guardian. Nothing. Marcus stood up. He looked around the wreck one more time, checking. There was no one else. Whatever ship this pod had come from was gone. Whatever adult had been supposed to be with these hatchlings was not here. They were alone. He stepped back from the pod. This was not his problem. He turned and started walking back toward the cabin. The rain was getting heavier. His leg was aching. He focused on the path ahead and kept moving and told himself that he had done the right thing by looking, and now the right thing was to go home and make a report call in the morning and that would be the end of it. He made it about 30 steps. Then the sound came. Not a cry. Not a shriek or a hiss or anything that sounded dangerous or demanding. Just a sound, soft, barely there, almost lost in the noise of the storm. A small, weak whimper. The kind of sound that had no anger in it. No threat. Just something very small and very cold, making the only sound it knew how to make. Marcus stopped walking. He stood in the rain with his back to the pod and his jaw tight and his hands balled up in his coat pockets. He stood there for a long time. Long enough for the rain to soak through his shoulders. Long enough for the cold to settle into his bad leg and make it ache deep down to the bone. He thought about Danny. He thought about the mission. He thought about 8 years of everything the Vreth had taken. Then he turned around and walked back. He did not let himself think too hard about why. He just pulled the cracked panel of the pod back as far as it would go and reached inside carefully, and began moving the debris away from the 3 small trembling things in the middle of the wreck. The smallest one turned its blind head toward the warmth of his hand. Marcus said nothing. He just worked. Marcus brought them inside because the storm left him no other choice. That was what he told himself. He laid them on the floor near the wood stove, still wrapped in the piece of padded lining he had pulled from the pod. They were soaked through and shaking badly. He built the fire up higher than usual and crouched close and watched them. 3 tiny bodies. 3 small chests rising and falling too fast. He had no idea if fast breathing was normal for them or if they were dying. He did not know anything about them. That was the problem. He knew how to treat human wounds. He had done it in the field more times than he could count. He knew pressure and elevation and how to keep a man calm when things were bad. But these were not human. These were Vreth hatchlings, newborns, and he had absolutely no information about what they needed to survive the night. He started with warmth because warmth seemed like the safest guess. He kept the fire going and moved them close enough to feel the heat but not so close it would burn. Within an hour the shaking slowed. That felt like progress. Then one of them opened its mouth. Then another. Then the third. They were hungry. Marcus stood in his kitchen for 5 full minutes staring at the inside of his refrigerator. He had eggs, some leftover meat from 2 days ago, bread and half a block of cheese. He had no idea what baby Vreth ate. He did not even know if they could eat solid food yet. Their eyes were still sealed shut. Their teeth, if they had any, were not visible. They were very young. He tried a small piece of soft meat first, pulled apart into the tiniest pieces he could manage. He placed it near the mouth of the largest one. It turned its head away. He tried the second. Same result. He tried the third, the smallest one, and it sniffed the piece with a tiny motion and then turned away too. He tried egg cooked soft. No. He tried warm water on his fingertip, touching it gently to the smallest one's mouth. It responded to that. A small tongue came out. Cautious then more deliberate. Water then. That was something at least. He spent the rest of that first night reading everything he could find on his tablet. There was not much on Vreth biology available to the general public, but he found fragments. Old field reports, a few scientific papers from before the war, a xenobiology summary that had been declassified 2 years ago. He read all of it. He took notes on a scrap of paper with a pencil, the way he used to plan field operations. By dawn his eyes were burning and he had 3 pages of rough notes and a slightly better idea of what he was dealing with. Vreth hatchlings in their first weeks needed protein, but in liquid form. Their digestive systems were not ready for solid food yet. They needed warmth above everything else. And they needed contact. The papers described it as thermal bonding. In the wild, hatchlings piled together and against their mother for shared heat and security. Without it they declined quickly. Marcus looked at the 3 small creatures by the stove. He pulled his chair over and sat beside them. He did not touch them. But he stayed close. Over the next several days he worked out a feeding system. He had no way to get proper supplies without explaining things he was not ready to explain, so he improvised. He cooked meat down into a soft broth, thin enough to be manageable, and fed it to them drop by drop using a small cloth he had cut from an old shirt. It was slow, tedious work. The largest one bit him on the second day, not hard, more out of confusion than aggression. The middle one was calmer and took the feeding more easily. The smallest one was the most uncertain at first, pulling back every time his hand came near. But the smallest one was also the one that watched him the most. Even with its eyes still sealed, it seemed to track him by sound and warmth. When he moved across the room it turned its head in his direction. When he sat down it would shift its small body slightly, orienting toward him. By the end of the first week, all 3 were stronger. Their shaking had stopped. They were eating regularly and keeping it down, which he had not been certain would happen in the early days. He started to breathe a little easier. He did not name them. He was not going to name them. The largest one he mentally called Big, which was not a name, just a description. The middle one was just middle. And the smallest one was just small. That was all. They were temporary. They were not his. He was keeping them alive until he figured out the next step. Then one night he fell asleep in the chair by the stove, which he had been doing most nights because the floor near the fire was where they slept and he had gotten into the habit of staying close. He woke sometime around 3 in the morning to find the smallest one had crawled onto his chest and gone to sleep there. It was so small he had not felt it happen. It was just there, a tiny warm weight, rising and falling with his breathing like it had decided that was the correct place to be. He looked at it for a long moment. Pip, he said quietly. He did not know where the name came from. It was just there. Pip did not move. It just kept sleeping. Marcus put one careful hand over it, very gently, and closed his eyes again. He did not think about the war that night. He heard the vehicles before he saw them. It was early morning, just past sunrise, and Marcus was outside splitting wood when the sound reached him. Not one vehicle. Several. Moving through the forest road that led to his cabin. He set the axe down slowly and straightened up and listened. The sound was wrong for human vehicles. Too smooth. Too quiet underneath. A different kind of engine. He knew that sound. He had heard it on the battlefield. He walked inside without rushing. Pip was on the table watching him with eyes that had fully opened 3 days ago, bright amber, sharp, constantly curious. Big and Middle were on the floor near the stove, wrestling with each other in the slow, clumsy way they had started doing now that they were stronger. He looked at all 3 of them for a moment. Then he pulled on his jacket and went back outside to wait. There were 4 of them. Dark vehicles, low to the ground, Vreth design. They came up the road and stopped in a line about 20 meters from the cabin. For a moment nothing happened. Then the doors opened and they came out. 7 Vreth soldiers. Full gear, weapons drawn but pointed down. They were tall, the way Marcus remembered, long dark bodies, scaled, moving with that fluid-controlled motion that he had spent years learning to read in combat. They spread out in a loose formation as they approached. Professional. Careful. One of them walked at the front. She was slightly shorter than the others, but the way the rest of them positioned around her made it clear she was in charge. Her armor was different. Fewer markings than he would have expected for a commanding officer, like someone who had taken things off rather than added them. Her eyes were a pale yellow and they were fixed on Marcus with the kind of steadiness that came from experience, not aggression. Marcus stood on his porch and did not move. The commander stopped about 5 meters away. The 6 soldiers behind her held their positions. Everyone was very still. She spoke. Marcus did not understand the words, but the tone was controlled, formal. A question, he thought. Or a demand. He held up one hand, palm out. Then he pointed at the cabin door. Then at himself. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, the way you moved when you wanted someone to understand you were not a threat. He turned and opened the cabin door. For a moment nothing happened. Then Pip came through the door. The small hatchling moved past Marcus's leg and onto the porch and stopped, looking out at the gathered soldiers with those bright amber eyes. There was a sound from the soldiers, not loud, but Marcus caught it. Something between a breath and a word. One of the soldiers at the back took a half step forward before stopping himself. Then Big came out. Then Middle. All 3 of them stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the strangers. Then Pip turned around and climbed straight up Marcus's leg and onto his arm and settled there, curling its tail around his wrist like it had done 100 times before. Big went and sat on his boot. Middle pressed against his calf and stayed there. Marcus stood very still and let it happen. He looked at the commander. She was staring at him. Not with the controlled professional expression she had worn 30 seconds ago. That was gone. What was on her face now was something else entirely. He could not read Vreth expressions the way he could read human ones, but whatever this was, it was not what she had come here expecting to feel. She said something quietly. Not to her soldiers. Almost to herself. She walked forward. Her soldiers shifted, but she raised one hand without looking back and they held their positions. She came to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. She was close now. Close enough that Marcus could see the faded scarring on the side of her neck that her armor did not quite cover. Combat scarring. Old ones. She had been in the war too. She looked at the hatchlings. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the cabin behind him, the warm light coming through the window, the small folded cloth near the door that Pip used as a sleeping spot, the dish on the porch railing that Marcus used for their morning feeding. She was reading the story of the last 2 weeks without him having to say a word. Pip chose that moment to make a small sound and butt its head against the side of Marcus's face. Marcus did not react. He just stood there and let it happen and kept his eyes on the commander. Something moved through her expression. Something that started in her eyes and changed the set of her jaw and the angle of her shoulders. It was not a small change. It was the kind of change that happened when a person saw something they had not believed was possible and had to rearrange something inside themselves to make room for it. She reached out slowly. Deliberately. Her hand moved toward Big, who was still sitting on Marcus's boot. Big looked at her hand. Sniffed it. Then turned around and sat back down on Marcus's boot. One of the soldiers behind her made a sound that Marcus was almost certain was a laugh, quickly covered. The commander lowered her hand. She straightened up. She looked at Marcus again, and this time there was something almost human in it. Not softness exactly. More like recognition. The look one soldier gives another when they understand, without speaking, that they have both been through something that changed them. Marcus gave a small nod. After a long moment she nodded back. The weapons behind her had been holstered without anyone giving an order. They stayed for 2 hours. The commander and Marcus sat on opposite sides of the porch while her soldiers waited by the vehicles. There was no shared language between them, not really. She knew a few human words and he knew none of hers. But they managed. She had a small translation device on her wrist that handled the basics, and the basics were enough. She told him the hatchlings were from a scouting vessel that had suffered a critical failure 3 weeks ago. The mother had not survived. The pod had been ejected automatically. They had been searching since then, covering wide ground, not certain the hatchlings were even still alive after this long. Marcus listened and said nothing. She asked how he had fed them. He showed her the cloth, the broth method, the routine he had worked out through trial and error over sleepless nights. She studied everything carefully. She asked questions through the device and he answered them plainly. At one point she picked up his scrap of paper with the notes he had made from the declassified papers and read through it slowly. She looked up at him after. He could not read her expression exactly, but he thought it was something close to disbelief. When the 2 hours were done, she stood and her soldiers came forward. It was time. Everyone understood that without it being said. The hatchlings belonged with their own kind. They needed more than one man in a cabin could give them. They needed a colony, proper care, others of their species. Marcus had known this from the beginning, or at least he had known it in the part of him that thought clearly. He crouched down on the porch and looked at all 3 of them. Big was already distracted by one of the soldiers who had crouched nearby, regarding the hatchling with an expression Marcus could only describe as overwhelmed relief. Middle was moving between Marcus and the soldier cautiously, curious the way it always was about new things. Marcus put his hand out flat and Middle stepped onto it briefly and then stepped off again and moved toward the soldier, and that was that. Big followed Middle. 2 down. He looked at Pip. Pip was sitting very still and looking at him. Those bright amber eyes, sharp and aware, tracking his face the way they had done since the moment they opened. The small tail was not moving. Usually the tail was always moving. Marcus held out his hand. Pip did not move toward the soldiers. It walked forward and stepped onto his hand and then walked up his arm to his shoulder and pressed its small head against the side of his face. Not moving. Just pressing there, still and quiet. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He reached up and gently lifted Pip from his shoulder. He held the small creature in both hands at eye level and looked at it for a long moment. Pip looked back. Marcus could feel the warmth of it against his palms, the slight movement of its breathing, the way its tail curled loosely around one of his fingers without gripping. He turned and held Pip out toward the commander. She stepped forward and reached out to take it. Pip went still. Then it turned its head and pressed its face hard into Marcus's scarred left hand, the hand that had the long burn scar running from the wrist to the base of the fingers, the one he had stopped noticing years ago. Pip pressed against it and did not move. Marcus stood there. The commander stood there. No one spoke. After a moment she lowered her hands. She did not take Pip. She just stood and watched, and something was working through her expression that Marcus could see even without understanding it fully. She looked at his scarred hand. She looked at Pip. She looked at his face. She said something. Not to her soldiers. To him. The translation device on her wrist worked for a few seconds and then produced the words in flat mechanical tone. Will you come? Marcus looked at her. The device added the rest slowly as she spoke. To the colony. As guardian. For the 3. It is a thing our people recognize. A bonded guardian. It is not a small thing to ask. But what I have seen today is not a small thing either. Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked out at the tree line. At the road that led to the town he never visited. At the cabin behind him with its fixed roof and its cracked window he had never gotten around to replacing, and its wood stove that he had kept burning for 2 weeks to keep 3 small creatures warm. He thought about the life he had been living here. The silence he had chosen. The long mornings sitting on the edge of the bed. The weight with no name. He thought about Pip sleeping on his chest that first night, a warmth so small he had not felt it arrive. He looked down at the hatchling still pressed against his scarred hand. For the first time in a long time, Marcus did not think about what he was walking away from. He thought about what he would be walking toward. It was not certain. It would not be easy. He did not speak the language and he did not know the place, and there was a long history between his people and theirs that would not disappear because of 1 man and 3 hatchlings. But Pip was warm against his hand. And the weight in his chest, the one that had no name, was not as heavy as it had been this morning. He turned back toward the cabin. He packed 1 bag. It did not take long. He had never unpacked much to begin with. When he came back out, the commander was waiting. Her soldiers were ready. Pip was sitting on the porch step looking up at him with those amber eyes. Marcus picked up the small hatchling and settled it against his shoulder. He walked to the vehicle. He did not look back at the cabin. There was nothing there that he needed anymore. The man who had come home broken had been sitting in that silence long enough. Something worth living for had found him in a storm. He was not going to let it go.